All of them knew they were about to die. The door burst open. The hinges snapped like hair and the heavy wooden door crashed to the ground. A startled cry escaped from everyone in the room. Nothing stood behind the door. They kept staring at the empty space of the doorframe and the night beyond, as if willing something to appear. Did she come in? Is she still outside? They couldn't tell. The men opted to arm themselves with whatever they could. One grabbed a candlestick, another sword that hung from the wall. One found a blunt axe standing in the corner. All the last man could grab in his panic was a butter knife that lay on the dining table. They huddled together and stared at the door, awaiting some terror to step through. None of them noticed the window opening behind them. Cold hands closed over the mouth of the axe-wielding man. The others felt a gush of wind. They turned around to find an empty spot near where their friend once stood. A shrill cry came from Mary before her hands could catch her mouth. The silence after the cry made it easier to hear a dripping sound. They all turned the door once again to see a pool of blood gathering on the floor. Ripples traveled through the puddle as blood dripped from above. All their eyes drifted upwards in unison until they saw her, sitting on one of the beams above. Her eyes were closed, her nails dug in the side and shoulder of the missing man. Her teeth were sunk into his neck. Blood flowed over his chest and down his arm. All of them could hear her rhythmic swallowing and her soft moans of satisfaction. She pulled her body closer, pushing it into herself as she relieved him of his blood. After a few seconds, she opened her eyes and stared directly at the three men and a woman that used to be her sister. She released the man and he fell onto the floor. A loud thud and the crack of a neck rang through the room as he hit the ground. His eyes were open and glazed over. An expression of terror was now permanently etched into his face. A symphony of gasps and cries erupted as the body came to rest before them. Julia swung her feet down. She hung from the beam by the tips of her fingers before gracefully dropping to the floor. None of them were sure they heard the faintest sound as she came down. Her movements were fluid, smooth as silk. Every action was certain and precise. If their hearts could chill any further, it would have. Whatever she was, they knew she wasn't human. Not anymore. The way she moved, the way she stared at them, it screamed abnormal. Even her eyes, they never saw it dart around. They just realized it wasn't staring at the same place as before. The man with the sword stood in front, a wordless decision by the others that he didn't agree with. When confronted with horror, you only have two options: fight or flight. When said horror is standing between you and the door, those options are significantly reduced. His sweaty hands gripped the sword and he charged. He swung the sword from high, then from the side, then back again. Julia watched the sword coming and stepped out of the way long before it even reached her. Her eyes followed the sword effortlessly as it swung wildly at her. Her feet stepped slowly around the man who was desperately trying to slice her, but he was woefully outmatched. The man gripped tight once more and swung for her neck. To his surprise, she didn't move out of the way. When the sword came to a sudden stop near her neck, he thought he had lodged the sword into her throat, but his joy was short-lived. His eyes just weren't fast enough to see her arm move. Once his eyes had time to focus, he could see that she held the tip of the sword between the two fingers. She caught it, like an insignificant bug. While it looked like she enjoyed the dance for a few seconds, as if testing her newfound abilities, she was done with this. Her free arm shot out, and 3 fingers crashed into his chest and pierced his heart. He tried to scream in pain, but his lungs filled with blood, so it came out as gurgled gasping. He collapsed to the ground, leaving only the butter knife-wielding gentleman and her one sister. She fixated on Mary, recognition in her eyes. The remaining man charged at her. She didn't even blink as she swatted him aside, her eyes never leaving her sister. He crashed through the table and hit the far wall. Mary stumbled back, fell over to her feet, and pressed her back against the wall. Her feet and hands scraped over the dusty floor as she tried to get as far away from what used to be her sister as possible. Julia walked toward her, slowly, deliberately. She knelt down before Mary and pried her hands from her face. "Who are you?" Julia asked. Mary's face was cascading with tears, but she could still see the shock in her eyes. It was Julia's voice, but it was calmer and deeper than she'd ever heard it. She just killed men without blinking, and she was more composed than she'd ever been. "It's me, Mary. I'm your sister," she whispered, trying her best to keep her teeth from clattering. "No, not anymore," Julia replied after a few seconds. She clasped one hand around the side of Mary's neck. Mary went stiff and closed her eyes, bracing for the worst. Julia slowly stood up, bringing her sister with her. Mary held her breath, the pain being lifted by her neck distracted her from the fact that her feet were now dangling in the air. Julia, carrying her sister with one hand, brought her to her lips. She sunk her fangs into her neck. Blood erupted from Mary and filled Julia's mouth. She waited until her mouth was full before swallowing, feeling the warmth run down her throat and fill her belly. She drained her sister, rhythmically filling her mouth with blood before swallowing. Her eyes were closed, and her skin changed from pale white to a healthy pink and every swallow. She was so locked into the moment that she did not notice the man getting to his feet near the side of the wall. The man slowly got up and tried to stand on shaky legs. He knelt down to pick up his trusty butter knife. He slowly started walking towards Julia, legs getting more solid with every step. Julia finally dropped what used to be her sister. Mary came to rest on the ground, cold, stiff, eyes glazed over. Julia turned to the man and watched him approach. He had no other recourse, so he just kept going. Julia did not move. She still wanted to test out some of her new abilities. The man lunged forward and stabbed the butter knife into her chest. She stood and took it. The man stumbled back and stared at this thing with a knife protruding out of the center of her chest, smiling at him. An innocuous tool, a butter knife, although it should be noted that this was back in the time when silverware was actually made out of silver. Julia took a confident step forward, a ravenous smile on her blood-soaked lips. Her next step was not so confident. Her step wavered. Her smile dropped. She glanced down at the butter knife resting in her chest. The sizzling sound was getting louder by the second. A thin trail of smoke rose from the wound. Ash replaced her flesh and poured out of her. Her knees buckled and she tumbled. Her face was twisting in shock and agony. The stab felt like a pinch. This felt like torture. An orange glow came from within her as the sizzling grew louder and the smoke got thicker. She desperately yanked the butter knife out of herself. But it was too late. The orange glow grew more intense. Her chest was slowly becoming an ash-filled crater. As the pain reached its peak, she let out a deep roar filled with ash and smoke. Julia fell forward, and her body scattered as she hit the ground. Her torso dissolved into a mound of ash as the glow spread the rest of her body. In a matter of seconds, there was nothing of Julia left. The man stared in awe. Something he didn't understand happened to make something he couldn't comprehend, and he didn't know what to make of it. Regardless, he felt relieved. The monster, that bore a striking resemblance of a woman called Julia, was now dead. He saw his friends get slaughtered right in front of his eyes. Even now, his shoes were drenched in their blood, pooling on the floor. He felt traumatized, yet relieved. At least it's over. The monster is dead. After a few minutes of stirring around the room, trying to come up to grips with his surroundings, he headed for the door. He didn't know what he would tell the townsfolk. There would be no way he could tell the story truthfully. There would be no way he could make them understand the horrors he witnessed. But they would never have to face the horrors themselves, and of that he felt proud. A hand clasped around his ankle. He yelled before he could stop himself and looked down. Those eyes were looking back at him. A man, his first friend, the first one to be taken. He was staring back at him, his hand holding onto the man's ankles with an iron grip. No matter how much he shook or twisted his leg, he could not get it to release. His body was writhing, as if settling into itself. His arm, which bent to the side, had its bones sticking out of the skin, unbent itself and healed. The man could hear his broken jaw snap back into place. Finally, the man could speak. "Thirsty," was all he said before his mouth shot open and bit into the man's calf. From outside, a scream could be heard. A scream that was stopped short by a loud crack. The village could hear none of this, though. The last scream of the man who almost stopped it, but could not. The rise had begun. Thank you for reading the story. I apologize for the long time, and I may have to split this video into two. I hope you guys enjoyed this. What did you think of this video? Let me know down below. How can I improve my narrating? I apologize at the end. My voice started getting very exhausted, as this is the longest passage I have read out loud thus far. Thank you all for tuning in, and I hope you all have a wonderful night. Thank you.